Now, for this afternoon's featured attraction, Ken Vogel. Much of what Ken knows and writes about politics and money in his new book, Big Money, grew out of his work as a political reporter for Politico over the past 7 years. But before he started at Politico in 2007, Ken worked his way there through a number of journalistic and political jobs. He reported for the News Tribune in Washington State, for the Times Leader in Wilkes-Barre, Pennsylvania, and for the Journal Enquirer in Manchester, Connecticut. Along the way, he came to focus on state politics, but he really wanted to get to Washington and cover national politics. In 2006, he landed a fellowship from the American Political Science Association, which did bring him to Washington and to the U.S. Congress, where he worked on the staffs of two House committees, both Republican and Democratic, because he wanted to remain even-handed. And that eventually did lead him to land a job with Politico just as that news organization was taking shape. So Ken knows his subject, and it shows in Big Money, which covers the gamut of super-rich political donors from the Koch brothers to George Soros and many, many others. The book is both informative and fun. As a review in the Wall Street Journal said admiringly of Ken, he, quote, has made the subject of money and politics entertaining, indeed gripping. He does this by a combination of factual analysis, eyebrow-raising scoops, and zany stories. Ladies and gentlemen, please join me in welcoming Ken Vogel.
Thanks all you guys for coming out. Thanks to Brad for the kind introduction and the invitation, and also for the institution that is Politics Prose, which is quite a treasure and kind of intimidating being here 6 days before Hillary Clinton is coming, but I'll try to represent well. Actually, Hillary Clinton, interestingly, was the basis for the movie that became the Citizens United versus Federal Election Commission case that struck down a lot of these campaign finance laws, and in some ways was my motivation for writing this book. We're really at the dawn. Citizens United and a handful of other cases and legislative developments have created a brand new sort of politics that we're just experiencing the very beginning of. And so the book, Big Money, was my effort to chronicle the creation, the sort of beginnings of this new politics, and to pull back the curtain a little bit, because I think when you hear some of the numbers that are thrown around, or the just jaw-dropping amounts of spending that we're seeing in elections, and you see the net worths of some of the folks who are doing that spending, it's all like a little dizzying, and it's almost like so big it doesn't really mean anything. And so this was an effort to, as is my reporting at Politico, an effort to look at some of the personal side of this, both the donors themselves and sort of their motivations and their personalities, and in some cases the origins of their wealth, to the extent that they're linked to their motivations for their spending, and then the effects of this. It's one thing to see an eye-popping figure about $20 million. There was a New York Times front page story today on the Alaska Senate race, which I'll just tell you, if you went, that everything that is in that story was already reported at Politico, but nonetheless, it put some interesting context. And the $20 million spent in Alaska in the primaries for the U.S. Senate campaign on, I forget the number, but it was hundreds and hundreds of ads. It's just in Alaska, which is sort of new to this type of big money spending. So these numbers are huge, but what do they all mean, and sort of what effect does it have ultimately? So that's sort of what I set out to do here. And the donors themselves are in some ways also easy to oversimplify, and there's sort of commonly accepted cliches of these folks as these, Machiavellian billionaires, puppeteers who are manipulating the politics, and I wanted to look at them and sort of put some flesh on the bones of who these folks are and what their motivations are. And so one of the things that I found when I was looking at it is, certainly there are some folks who have a personal financial interest in this new sort of spending that they're doing, putting these new, huge sums into politics and into political advertising as a result of the new flexibility afforded them by these decisions. And in some cases, maybe they are benefiting. Maybe they are helping to elect politicians or helping to enact policies that redound to their own personal financial benefit in the form of, tax breaks or regulations that help them make more money. But I also found that there was a really interesting mix of sort of passion and ego that was involved. And the comparison that I make in the book is to these really wealthy folks who have been, spectacularly successful in whatever their chosen field, whether it was industry or oil or software or hedge funds, and they are sports junkies. And so they've bought all the cars and yachts and vacation homes and contributed however much to the hospitals and gotten their names on the side of buildings and at their alma maters. And what's next for them? And so for these sports junkies, they're willing to plunk down $200 million for a sports team. Or in the case of Steve Ballmer, the former Microsoft CEO, who reached an agreement in principle to buy the LA Clippers, $2 billion for the LA Clippers. And I found there was a lot of similarities with the folks who were in a similar position but were political junkies. And what's next for them? Well, hey, I'm going to try to buy the U.S. presidency or buy the Republican presidential nomination for Newt Gingrich. In the case of Sheldon Adelson, the Las Vegas casino mogul, who spent $20 million of his and his family's money trying to get Newt Gingrich elected president, first trying to get him the Republican presidential nomination. And, that's in and of itself kind of astounding that $20 million could be spent trying to get this guy the nomination. But in the end, obviously it was unsuccessful. And I equate it a little bit to some of the ways in which these sports junkie billionaires end up spending their money. So they think, well, I've been super successful at whatever my field is in which I made all this money. And there's a tendency to think, well, that expertise and that aptitude that I displayed or that my company displayed in making all that money should be applicable to sports. So take a local example, Dan Snyder, the owner of the Redskins, since he bought the team, has been meddling in the affairs of the team and telling the GM or strongly suggesting which players to draft or which players to bring in through free agency, suggesting to the coach what types of plays he'd like to see for those players. And the result has been spectacularly unsuccessful. The Redskins stink and have since Dan Snyder has been the owner. And so you see some of these folks who are the mega donors who are putting all this money into politics who similarly think, Sheldon Adelson might be a bad example, but let's take Foster Freeze. If you remember back to the 2012 Republican presidential primary, Foster Freeze was the sugar daddy supporting Rick Santorum's campaign, and he was suggesting to these super PACs, this super PAC to which he ended up giving $2-point-something million, my number one issue that I'm really concerned about and that I know Rick Santorum is concerned about is the threat of Islamofascism, he called it, Islamic extremism. So he had this super PAC that was going on the air in some of these early primary states in South Carolina and New Hampshire, and it was airing ads about the threat of Islamic extremism. And if you follow presidential politics at the primary level, that's not really an issue that a lot of Republican primary or any primary voters are going to the polls thinking about. They're thinking about health care. They're thinking about, their own income and their own, their ability to sort of make ends meet. But Foster Freeze, that's not what he cared about. He was already doing fine. He cared about Islamic extremism. So in the end, while both Foster Friess and his support of Rick Santorum, and Sheldon Adelson and his support of Newt Gingrich had an effect on the primary. The primary ended up lasting a lot longer than it may otherwise have done. They were ultimately unsuccessful. They were kind of like Dan Snyder. They didn't get what they wanted. In fact, you could argue that maybe in their pursuit of their ultimate goal, defeating Barack Obama, they may have actually had the reverse effect, that by dragging out the primary for that long, spending all this money, propping up these candidates, it actually hurt Mitt Romney, the eventual Republican nominee, and therefore helped Barack Obama. And so there was sort of a Dan Snyder-esque backfiring. Now, that said, I don't want to suggest that all this spending is having no effect. I think it is actually having quite a pronounced effect on our governance. And you need look no further than the 2013 government shutdown, when all these Tea Party Republicans who were elected in the Tea Party wave of 2010 with the help of outside spending from some of these groups that are backed by the Koch brothers and some of the other big name Republican donors and other donors on the right, these folks didn't want to go along with John Boehner and Mitch McConnell and their brokered agreement to attempt to end the shutdown that they reached with Barack Obama and the Democrats. They refused to go along, and you know what? They didn't have to. In fact, it's arguable that it may have helped them in terms of electorally to buck the party and to refuse to go along and to push the country into shutdown, because while in the past the party sort of controlled the power and the money, and if you didn't go along with the party, you could be hurt in the next election because the party could withhold its support, or even, in extreme examples, support a primary challenger to you. Well, now you don't need the party anymore if you're one of these new Tea Party members. In fact, you need you need these outside groups. You need the Koch brothers. You need some of these big donors who have given to these super PACs and nonprofit groups that are opposed to the agreement that John Boehner tried to strike to raise the debt ceiling and to keep the federal government open. So if you were to have gone along with that agreement, those groups could have come after you, just like they came after your opponent in 2010. So that's the real sort of governing effect. I think that this big spending has, in many ways, sort of exacerbated the gridlock that we see. And there are obviously a number of other factors that have done that, but it's sort of one way in which, even if ultimately the groups that help fund those Tea Party groups that helped elect these folks who refused to go along, even if they didn't get their ultimate goal, which would have been to reduce, federal government spending to a point where any increase in the debt ceiling was offset by reductions in spending. They didn't get that, and so they didn't get what they really wanted, but they had a huge impact in that we had this federal government shutdown. So far, you note I'm talking about Republicans more and the right more, and that's because this spending since Citizens United, and you could kind of go back further, but it's really sort of exploded since Citizens United, has been more embraced on the right by Republicans and by conservatives. And I think that that's partly because we have seen a struggle sort of for the soul of the Republican Party. There's no leader at the top of the Republican Party who is sort of the unquestioned leader who has set the ideological moorings of the party, and so there's sort of more of an open field, and this type of spending is both more impactful in that it can help shape the direction of the party, and the donors are more likely to want to spend to help shape the direction of the party and to recapture power for the party. However, we're coming up now in a period, and I sort of, tracing the arc of the book that I get to towards the end of the book, looking forward, where Democrats are going to be the ones who are sort of casting about for both a new leader, after we're at the tail end of the Obama presidency and already looking forward to Hillary on Friday and Hillary in 2016. and also sort of casting about for like a new compass, a new sort of ideological set post-Obama. What is the Democratic Party going to represent? And this is where these big donors on the left are going to have a huge say, I think, and already are signaling where they want the party to head. You have a donor who I write about out in San Francisco, who's a retired hedge fund guy. Tom Steyer is his name. He's been extremely dissatisfied with the Obama administration's actions, or from his perspective, lack of action to combat climate change, even with the new regulatory initiative that we're seeing rolled out here. And so he is talking about spending $50 million of his own money in the 2014 midterm elections to elect candidates, Democrats, primarily, I guess exclusively Democrats, who, in his mind, are sufficiently aggressive in their proposals to combat climate change. Stands to reason that if he's willing to spend $50 million to this end in 2014, he's probably going to be willing to spend that much or more, potentially quite a bit more, in 2016 to elect a Democrat, to get a Democrat the party's nomination, presidential nomination in 2016, to get that nomination to go to a candidate who is sufficiently environmentally aggressive on his sort of core set of issues. Well, is that Hillary Clinton, or is Hillary Clinton sort of insufficiently aggressive from his perspective? Ditto on income inequality, economic inequality, another issue where progressives have kind of been less than pleased with some of the steps by the Obama administration and by the Democrats in Congress, Democratic leadership in Congress. You have the potential, really, like you had with Republicans in 2012, for just a single billionaire or a small group of multimillionaires to really throw the party's plans and the plans that the party has. I mean, it certainly appears as if a number of the party's sort of biggest operatives and biggest thinkers, as well as some of its deepest pockets, are attempting to align behind Hillary Clinton headed into the 2016 presidential nomination. But there's certainly, with some of these big donors, and you go out and talk to some of the wealthiest Democrats, they don't think that Hillary is sufficiently aggressive on economic inequality, that she represents sort of this populist strain that's rising in the Democratic Party. So despite all these efforts to sort of line things up for Hillary and position her to win the party's nomination, all it would take is, one deep pocket, one billionaire who's willing to write a $20 million like Sheldon Adelson supporting Newt Gingrich, supporting, say, Elizabeth Warren or Howard Dean or Russ Feingold, or another candidate who sort of more represents the populist progressive strain of the Democratic Party. And I sort of end the book by saying that Sheldon Adelson spent $20 million. It's not out of the realm of possibility that a single donor might spend $100 million or $500 million. One of the things to either elect Hillary or to elect a Democrat other than Hillary. One of the things the questions that's been put to me as I sort of talk about this and rehash some of 2012 as well. Why didn't someone spend? In fact, I did. Morning Joe was the first. The book came out Tuesday, and I did Morning Joe as the first TV hit that I did. And Mark Halpern asked me, well, it always puzzled me. Sheldon Adelson is worth $40 billion. Why did he only spend $20 million to try to elect Newt Gingrich? And it's come to that point where he only spent $20 million. It seems like a bizarre question, but it sort of stands to reason now in this new politics. Like, if you're worth $40 billion, why wouldn't you spend as much as you would pay for a sports team? If the Clippers are worth $2 billion, surely Newt Gingrich should be worth $1.5 billion. I don't know. So why didn't he spend more? And it caused me to think, and, some of it I have to wonder if maybe cooler heads didn't prevail. All the people who were around him saying, dude, maybe it's not such a good idea to spend all this money on Newt Gingrich, is kind of messing things up, and he's, he has no chance anyway. Maybe they got to him, and maybe they got him to think twice about it. Or maybe it's just that it was at the dawn of this new sort of campaign finance regime, and it seemed so, it seemed like just so extreme to be spending $20 million. And so now maybe we're getting used to this idea that like $20 million is what you spend on a primary for a super PAC supporting your favorite presidential candidate. Either way, I think that both of those things, if they were in fact what kept them from spending more money, sort of go out the window next time. I mean, next time, why should he stop at $20 million just because someone is telling him otherwise? And if it was the first time and he was the pioneer of it, maybe someone will see that $20 million and think that they can easily match it if at the level that these folks are playing. They are $20 million to them is like a hamburger for me or for most of the folks in this room. So that's sort of my the reason why I wrote the book and sort of what I see going forward. And I do think that whether your perspective is that this is an unfortunate development in our democracy, or whether you see it like John Roberts and think that money is speech and people should be able to spend as much as they want to influence elections. I think that some of these numbers will seem kind of quaint in 4 years or in 10 years, and so this is really the dawn of this new politics. And so just to kind of spin it even further forward before I take some questions is people ask me like, well, what could change this? What would be necessary for the laws or the sort of political mores to change enough where we, where this possibility that I'm talking about someone spending $100 million or $500 million will not come to pass. And I don't really have an answer for that, because I think that in the past, if you look at the arc of our campaign finance history and the legislation, it's always taken some huge, massive scandal in order to generate the public will and then the political will to enact serious campaign finance changes, to tighten the laws, to limit the flow of money into politics. And we're talking about, going back to 1896 and the robber barons, and, Teddy Roosevelt with the 1907 Tillman Act prohibited direct corporate contributions. And that was a result of both Roosevelt's own scandals, but also the 1896 election and the robber barons. And, more recently, you could look at Watergate, and Watergate created sort of the Watergate era reforms, created the broad contours of the campaign finance law that we have right now with the Federal Election Commission and the Federal Election Campaign Act. And then, the Enron, some of the Clinton fundraising scandals in the 90s and the Enron scandal in 2000 generated the public and the political will to pass McCain-Feingold. Well, we're kind of headed the opposite way. All those things that I just talked about, McCain-Feingold being the one that was really sort of undercut by these recent Supreme Court decisions. So not only are we headed the opposite way, where the campaign finance laws are being stripped away, but there is no... I'm sure I'd be curious to hear what you folks think as to whether just some of the stuff that we talked about should be scandal enough. But the fact that in the 2012 election there was $7 billion spent, and more of it was spent by these outside groups, $2.5 billion, which is the number in the subtitle of my book, was spent by these outside groups, versus $1.6 billion spent by the parties. Just goes to show you that the outside groups and the billionaires are really the power, and the money is migrating outside the system to sometimes rogue billionaires who are able to make these decisions that the party leaders used to make, either in negotiation with themselves, with other party leaders, or after consulting their constituents. Well, now we have this totally private system where these billionaires are able to do this, and you would think, well, maybe that should be a scandal in and of itself that would be sufficient to generate the will to change this. But I don't really get the sense, you don't see in Congress that there's a real likelihood that there will be campaign finance legislation reforms that will pass anytime soon. And so I'll just end it, I keep on saying it, but I'll end it with a personal story that, it's not just that the reason I decided to write the book is not just that we have this sea change that's occurring right in front of our eyes, but also that we're really at just the beginning of this sea change where there's still like some ability to see what's happening, and there is still some disclosure. There's a lot of disclosure depending on who you talk to, but these super PACs, they're required to reveal who their donors are. But there's also a rising tide that we saw in 2012 that I think we're seeing even more of in 2014 of secret and anonymous political giving. And so this seemed like a good time to try to reveal as much as possible about some of these big names and some of the folks who were giving, because there is increasingly an effort to take it sort of out of the public view and to take it, even further into secret, so there'll be less chance for reporters and for members of the public and for readers to sort of see where this money is getting spent. So the story that I lead off with, which is the suspicious vehicle. The suspicious vehicle is my own rental car, and when I went to try to cover the Koch brothers donor seminar in 2013, in April of 2013, it was the first one after this huge spending spree that they pioneered in 2012, and I wanted to try to figure out, who are these guys? Because it's not just the Koch brothers. They have a whole network of these wealthy donors who they bring together twice a year to raise all this money to give to these outside groups, which don't report their donors. So I figured, hey, they're bringing them all together. It's a great chance for me to try to figure out who they are. And so they are, very, very secretive about these donor meetings and who their donors are. So I managed to get into this hotel where they were having it and eavesdrop a little bit and hear conversations between, Nikki Haley, the governor of South Carolina and a rising Republican star, and some of these donors who she was sharing a glass of wine with, talking about fundraising and NASCAR. South Carolina is the home of Darlington, this big NASCAR racetrack. And Ron Johnson, the U.S. Senator from Wisconsin, was chatting with these two donors about how the RNC is no longer capable of doing the types of things that are necessary for Republicans to be successful, and that therefore we, referring to the Koch brothers as we, are the ones who should get their money, these two big donors who he's talking to. And I eventually interrupted the conversation with Ron Johnson, these two donors, because I felt bad eavesdropping on it. It's just me and them sitting there out by the pool. And sure enough, soon after that, the Koch brothers security and the hotel security identified me and escorted me out of this hotel and escorted me out to my rental car in the parking lot, and then took down the license plate of the rental car and reported me as suspicious to the Riverside County Sheriff, who spent the next several hours trying to track me down and question me about what I was doing at this hotel. And I explained I was a reporter and I was trying to get report. I was trying to get information on what I thought was like clearly something that was in the public interest to know about. But the Koch brothers and their security and the hotel security didn't take too kindly to that. In the end, though, the Riverside County Sheriff admitted to me he thought it was like a little bit weird, was the quote, that they would be reporting me as suspicious. But nonetheless, this is sort of what happened. It's my own sort of personal tale, one of many that's in the book, about trying to pull back the curtain on this new private elite that are really, starting to exercise control that was once public, that was once sort of more in the public eye. And, say what you will about the Republican National Committee or the Democratic National Committee, anyone here in this room could go and run for, precinct captain and work their way up and maybe eventually get on the Democratic National Committee. Maybe some of you in here also could end up making enough money that you'd be a billionaire and going to the Koch brothers conference, but it seems less likely and more likely that the system was sort of more open before, and that now with some of these changes, it's becoming more secretive and more difficult for small donors or activists or voters to have as much say as they used to. So maybe a depressing note to end on, but it seems like it works out with the timing to take some questions if anyone has them. Or I could tell another story.
Tell another story.
Okay. I'll let you go first, and then I'll answer your question, then tell another story.
First of all, in answer to your question, what has to happen for this system to change? A constitutional amendment or packing the Supreme Court. Otherwise, it can't be changed. A law will not do it. My question is, there was a sense, well, I have a couple. There was a sense in the 2012 election that all the Koch brothers' money didn't really accomplish what they wanted to accomplish. And so do you think their strategy will change in this election or 2016? The other question is that, do you think it makes that much difference in a presidential campaign? Or do you think there's enough free publicity so that the place where the money makes a difference is in those precinct races and for state rep and state senator? And in fact, that's how the terrible changing of the boundaries, I'm having seen it.
Redistricting,
Yes,
right,
redistricting. Yeah. That was the reason that the Democrats did so poorly in 2010.
Yeah. So 2 questions, but even before the question, I'm going to address the change. You know, what's necessary to change the law. The suggestion was only a constitutional amendment could change, and that seems to be the emerging consensus. But that is even more difficult than changing the law. And there's an anecdote that I have in the epilogue of the book where President Obama is talking to a number of very, very wealthy donors, including actually the aforementioned Steve Ballmer, who just bought the LA Clippers for $2 billion, or is in the midst of trying to do so. And Bill Gates is in this crowd as well. And this is again, the Koch brothers are secret, but this too was a secret meeting of, where Obama is talking to these folks, and someone raises the very question that you just raised about what can be done to change it. And he says, yes, a constitutional amendment is what's necessary. And he goes further and he says that he thinks that in his second term, maybe and this is, by the way, this meeting that I'm describing now was during his reelection campaign, so he is yet to be reelected, but he's saying, when I'm reelected, I think that I will have the political capital to be able to pursue this. And of course, he hasn't done that. And and in fact, there is there were hearings just this past week in the U.S. Senate about a constitutional amendment or legislation that could potentially be introduced that could change this system. So Obama has been something of a disappointment to a lot of the folks who think that big money, who actually saw in him a champion for changing politics and for limiting the role of big money in politics. There's a question about how much he could really do, but nonetheless, he's sort of hasn't done a whole lot on the issue, and in fact has gone the other way, has embraced super PACs and engaged in some of this stuff that he found so distasteful. As for the questions, the Koch brothers spent all this money in 2012. Didn't get a whole lot for it. Really, didn't get anything for it. At the federal level, they didn't win the White House back. Romney lost. The Senate remained in Democratic hands, and the balance of power in the House remained relatively unchanged. So what did they get for it, and will they change their strategy? What they got for it, as just discussed, nothing. Will they change their strategy? Yes, I think that they will and that they have. Actually, let me back up. I said nothing. I just described the government shutdown as something that occurred, in part, I think, because of this outside spending, including by the Koch brothers. So they have had an effect, but they did not get the change in the balance of power that maybe some on their side and some in their organization desired. So the way, actually, this relates directly to your second question, the way that they're changing it is, while they are still focusing on the federal level and changing some of their tactics, including some of the technology involved and some of the these are like tactical things. So the advertisements that they're doing now are less about Obama is bad and more about, sympathetic people looking right into the camera and saying, I lost my health care because of Obamacare. Call Kay Hagan in North Carolina, the U.S. Senator running for re-election, a tough race against a Republican who's gotten a lot of support from Koch brothers related organizations, Karl Rove organizations, and ask her why she supports this job killing Obamacare. So those are like tactical changes, but then the bigger substantive changes are focusing more on the state level, and both they and other organizations, deep-pocketed donors and their operatives on both the left and the right have sort of come to the conclusion that you suggested in your question, that some of this money can have a bigger impact on state races, even on U.S. House races, than on the higher profile races like U.S. Senate and like President, where no matter how much you spend, people, most voters sort of have an idea in their mind of what they think, who they like and what they think the results should be. So there's kind of a point of diminishing returns, whereas some of these state legislative races, governor's races, attorney general, or another big area where they see the potential to really shape public policy for less money, getting more bang for their buck, and potentially getting more out of the spending, because there's a lot of stuff, having covered state legislatures, that goes on in state legislatures that is extremely impactful, both on public policy, on some of the stuff that we talk about, minimum wage, but then on like tax cuts for businesses and just a range of stuff where that's where the action is. So that's where I think the spending is going to be, in addition to at the federal level.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Gerrymandering, that was the word.
Gerrymandering, yes. I don't know who was first here. You go first. Go for it.
Your title is Big Money.
Yeah.
And another thing that's big money is lobbying.
Right.
Do you have any comments about the effect of lobbying on
Yes.
the way rules and laws are enacted?
Yeah, the way that I put it in the book is, for a lot of these folks, the big spending in political campaigns is sort of for passion and ego, and the lobbying spending is for business. So for a lot of them, they recognize that you get better rate of return. We're talking about the rate of return. You spent $400 million, the Koch brothers did in 2012, and got nothing. Well, they got plenty out of their lobbying spending, and so too did most of these big donors who are spending a ton of money in elections. They realize that it's a safer bet and sort of easier to game the system, if you will, by spending money on lobbying, because not only is the lobbying money sort of spent across the board, you're going to whoever the committee chairman and ranking member are, regardless of their party, and trying to convince them of a more narrow, policy result that you desire, that is less sweeping than some of the election spending that is about a bigger swath of issues. So that is where you get the rate of return, and that's really where folks who don't want to draw attention to themselves but want to get something out of government, that's where they do the bulk of their spending. I cite a study, I'm going to get it wrong, but where they analyze, as an academic study, and they analyze like a particular bill that had to do with like offshore profits that are sort of what they were lobbying for. And what the bill did is allow some of these U.S. companies to like bring back some of the profits that they made offshore without like accruing the penalties. And they calculated like how much was spent lobbying on that bill versus like the benefit that they received, and it was some insane number like that. For like every like 20 cents that the companies lobbied, they got like $1 back, and so clearly that is where someone who is just interested in getting a personal benefit from government action is most spending their money. And frankly, that's in some ways, you talk to folks who think that the system is totally rigged in favor of the special interest and moneyed interest. That's where they're really manipulating the system to great effect, as opposed to the election spending, which we still have to vote, and so they have more impact sort of working the committee chair and ranking member, because it's one person, and it's more difficult to control all of us, no matter how much ads, how much you spend in advertising.
Do you think there's anything that can be done about this?
I mean, lobbying reform is something that has been, attempted in various forms for years and years. Most recently, actually, in 2007, after the Jack Abramoff scandal, and that was President Obama, then Senator Obama. That was his main legislative accomplishment in the U.S. Senate, was a provision in that bill. The bill was called the Honest Leadership and Government Act, or something like that. It passed in 2007, and he championed this provision that required the disclosure of contributions bundled by lobbyists. And so if you were a lobbyist and you went out and got 50 of your friends to give the maximum $5,000 to a campaign, the campaign had to list your name and then all the contributions that were credited to you. And there's already been all kinds of loopholes and ways discovered to get around that, but that was an effort to show exactly what I just talked about, that this is a more targeted and precise way, lobbying, and I guess contributions bundled by lobbyists fit under lobbying, to get what you want from government, as opposed to airing $20 million in the Alaska, Senate primary and television ads.
Thank you.
Thanks.
Hello. The Constitution gave us one man, one vote, and the Supreme Court seems to have given us $1, one vote, more or less, right?
That's certainly the perspective of folks critical of the Citizens United decision, yes.
Well, grassroots versus conspiracy by the rich. Any consideration, information, or ideas concerning crowdfunding a candidate?
Yeah, I mean, that's actually, interestingly, what President Obama got a lot of criticism in 2008, because he raised this record-shattering amount of money, $750 million at the time, record-shattering. But he really did. I mean, there have been some studies that have looked at the percentage of his money that came from small donors, but it really was an unprecedented amount that came from small donations. And it was both, he tapped into something in the sort of popular imagination, and it was the use of online and social media and stuff to really bring together this small donor army. And there was a lot of folks who were thinking that, independent of any laws that might change, that this was the future. And of course, what happened between that 2008 election and his re-election run was Citizens United. And so that kind of threw everything out the window. And that no matter how much in small donations he was able to gobble together, it could be offset by a single major donor writing a single check to his opponent. And that he ended up actually also sort of buying into this new system by virtue of endorsing the super PACs and schmoozing these big donors in a way that he didn't have to in 2008. So there have been some proposals before Congress to introduce introduce a congressional sort of matching fund system, where it would incentivize candidates to go out and get these small donations and then match them with some voluntarily contributed taxpayer checkoff. I don't really think that there's a whole lot of hope for that, because what I was talking about before, about there not being the sort of public will for serious legislative change. But whether some other candidate could come along and sort of catch a combination of the popular imagination and really inspire people to give small donations in sums that would be sufficient to offset these big donations, as well as maybe some new technological development. You see now, you can contribute via text message, you can the Federal Election Commission has allowed that, and all the mobile technology and stuff. I mean, it would have to be something I think it would have to be an innovation combination of a given politician or campaign and some kind of technological innovation that would lead towards something close to crowdsourcing. But whether it would ever be sufficient to offset the major donations, I don't know. Did that kind of answer the question? All right, cool. Let's go back over here.
This is much more a foundational question. because I simply don't buy that the solution is going to be, I lived a long time before I came to the United States in the Netherlands, right? This type of electoral gamesmanship would be, although Europe is also changing, let's just be honest about it, but this type of spending would be seen as really quite outrageous, But, notions of campaign finance reform, limiting this, I don't see it as basically, if the wealthy don't pay for the elections at this point in time, to a large extent, to be extremely cynical, they get the same results free of charge. Why? Because you're dealing with a system at this point in time. I mean, campaign finance and this huge amount of money that we're having spending now is a direct consequence of the neoliberal economic system, this mass accumulation of wealth in the hands of very few people, mass accumulation of influence in the hands of very few people, a movement right of the political system that allows this type of thing, and that celebrates wealthy people and et cetera, et cetera. So that if you're going to make reforms, you have to get at these more underlying type of issues, right? Massive redistribution of wealth, income, and power, massive democratization of the U.S. Democratic system, and partial type of solutions is, in my opinion, simply not going to fix it at this point in time, especially at a time when the problem that you have is a fracturing of citizenship, a fracturing of any sense of common interests, getting together, focusing on certain things, like in the past, at least there was. So I was wondering, have you thought about it? Did you write about this in your book? Did you encounter people who also have this opinion that to deal with these issues, much, much more radical fundamental reforms are necessary in the United States and basically across the West? Thank you.
Yeah, so question about the rising inequality and disparity in the distribution of wealth and the relation of that to the campaign finance system that I wrote about. And certainly I don't think it's a coincidence at all that or rather, I think it makes the new campaign finance system and the effects of it all the more sort of significant that this change is occurring at a time when the distribution of wealth is also changing in a way where an increasing concentration of wealth is accruing in the hands of a smaller and smaller percentage of people. As to whether that there is a move afoot to change, or whether any of the people who I talk to think that the solution is either a redistribution of wealth or policies that somehow either tax the wealthy more or provide more social services and more opportunity for advancement among those in the other 99%. It is actually interesting that there are very wealthy Democrats who talk about income inequality and talk about the need for increasing the minimum wage and attempt to use their money that they have accrued as part of the 1% to elect politicians who would push policies that would engender that end result. Ultimately, though, I think because of what I talked about, because all this money sort of gets almost lost in this slosh of just huge sums flowing into the process with questionable effect, I don't necessarily think that a very wealthy liberal donor is spending all this money supporting a candidate like Elizabeth Warren, for instance, who maybe would espouse some of the solutions that you're talking about, necessarily have the intended effect. She's still operating the system that we talked about, even if she wins and even if she is, even if she's elected president, where she is facing some of the entrenched advocacy groups on the left and the right, as well as, and perhaps even more importantly, the lobbyists that the prior questioner asked about, that really limits the ability to enact significant legislation that would address some of the foundational questions that you're talking about. So sorry for from your perspective, probably pessimistic answer, but that's kind of the way I see it. How are we doing with that?
Two more questions.
All right, let's go here and then here.
Okay. Hi. Eisenhower was famous for talking about the dangers of the military-industrial complex. I, by the way, agree with most everything you've said, but I'm going to do and here's a whole nother area. And the military-industrial complex does exist, but it basically hurts the military. And it's insidious, and it's almost impossible to change. Back in the 90s, there was a project called the ARCI project where the United States was very worried about Soviet sonar. And there was a new sonar developed for the military that was done at 1/4 of the cost. It saved $2 billion on the one project, and it had 10 times the performance. And that approach that was used was called open architecture. And if it's not right for all military projects, but if it was applied where it's right, it would be saving the U.S. military about $50 billion a year using a proven approach that would improve performance and decrease cycle time. The reason why it doesn't, the reason why it goes nowhere is exactly because of the military-industrial complex. And what it means in its essence is if you need something, be able to go to get it off the shelf or from a company, wherever is the best place in terms of value to get it. And what happens is the major defense contractors block it. The CEO of one of them, in fact, went into the Secretary of Defense and said, point blank, you get this through, you're going to put us out of business. I've asked 4-star Army generals, why doesn't somebody do something about this? And the answer it comes back is there's a saying in the military, you make your career in the field, but you can lose it back at the Pentagon. And I've been acting as an informal advisor to a Senate Oversight Committee about this. It's very deep. It hurts the U.S. military a lot, but the culture and everything is so deep between the vested interest and the money and the power, and it breaks my heart watching there's just this wasted money going on, and the approach could save tens of billions of dollars to buy more planes or to give back to the taxpayers or spend on something else and improve performance, and it's just stuck. By the way, the guy who was not the current, but the most recent Washington bureau chief of the New York Times he had been writing a series of articles about acquisition at DOD. He said everybody knows it's the 800-pound gorilla in the room. People don't talk about it. And he left to go do other things out in California, but said that was going to be my next article.
Yeah, well, defense contractors certainly are an example of a super powerful interest that has managed to get their way over the years through lobbying, more so than through campaign spending of the sort that I write about. And although they do some, they do plenty of campaign spending, but it's sort of this more targeted, give to the ranking member and chairman of the operative committees, and maybe all the members of the committees have a fundraiser. And so they're an example of an interest that really has Washington locked down and has sort of figured things out. Let's go over here.
I wanted to, I don't know if this is on, but anyway, I wanted to start out talking about the idea of economic statecraft, and I really appreciate the point that you make about the privatization of kind of these public affairs issues and money in general. And my question has to do with your research methodology, and I'm wondering if you can expand upon the way that, despite talking and researching all about capital inflow, if you can talk about the ways that you were able to research and understand capital outflow. I mean, we can talk about capital gains as sort of in the trickle-down economic sense, and maybe that would be sort of a logical funding for American prosperity. But on the other hand, can you talk about maybe the ways that capital outflow, I don't know, I'm thinking of offshore accounts, bigger questions of financial crimes such as money laundering or white-collar crime came up for you, and in your methodology, who you found to be important entities, individuals, and organizations that are addressing these questions?
Got it. So it's interesting, during the 2012 campaign, there was a lot of talk about outsourcing and some of the issues that you're talking about, because Mitt Romney was the Republican presidential candidate, and he at the private equity firm that he had helmed for years had engaged in rather a bit of offshoring in a way that was deemed, I think, by a lot of folks, but certainly by Democrats and labor and labor unions to be sort of antithetical to this idea of keeping prosperity in in the U.S. and sort of empowering the middle class. I didn't really deal a ton with it beyond that. One of the things I think is interesting when you talk about like capital outflow is I start thinking about this cottage industry that is that has sort of built up around the new campaign finance system, where there are these operatives and consultants who are making just an obscene amount of money off of all these checks that these big donors are writing. So I write about a little thing in the book. It's a little bit off topic, but I feel like it's maybe a fun way to end things. Is it's not always possible to tell like who's pocketing what, who's making how much money from this new type of spending. But one of the ways that I endeavored to do it was I looked at the Federal Election Commission Internal Revenue Service reports of how much these PACs and super PACs and nonprofits were spending, and then I took all the consultants' names and I ran them through the property records databases, and I found that a number of them were buying these big homes out in Old Town and Fort Hunt right after the election because they had made so much money. And so I do a little tour in the book where I drive around and check out the new houses that all these consultants have bought, and they're folks who were like roughly my age. There's young folks who had worked in the party system, which is not a super well-paying thing, and they go and it's kudos to them. They recognize like this is a growth industry, and they go and set up these consulting firms. And now these are, folks my age with like $2 million homes and like shiny new SUVs outside. And I'm like, Anyway, I really appreciate it. Maybe if you guys and all your friends all buy my book, I will buy a home next to those people. But